welcome to Paranormal Pages. Please drop a like or comment if you want to help the channel. Now let's get into the true scary stories. The shadows in my sleep. It started like any other night, with my dreams, strange, vivid, and unsettling. For as long as I could remember, my nights were filled with faces I didn't recognize, unfamiliar voices calling out to me from distant places. I never thought much of it. But last night, something was different. The same crowd of nameless people surrounded me, but this time, one man stood out. He wore a long black coat, his eyes dark pits, voids that seemed to swallow all light. He whispered my name. I felt my breath catch in my throat, and when I turned to run, I woke up in a cold sweat. I couldn't shake the dream the entire day. It wasn't just the man's face, but the way he said my name, as if he'd known me for years. I brushed it off as another strange vision and went about my morning routine, trying to forget the creeping feeling that something had changed. It wasn't until later that afternoon, as I walked home from work, that the dream came crashing into reality. There, on the corner of 7th and Maple, he was. The same man from my nightmare. Black coat. Hollow eyes. And he was watching me. I froze, my body going rigid. His lips curled into a smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. He began walking towards me, his movements slow and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. "Do I know you?" I managed to choke out as he came closer, the words almost laughable in their absurdity. Of course, I didn't know him. He was a figment of my subconscious, a nightmare. And yet, here he was, impossibly real. "You don't remember me, do you?" he asked, his voice smooth but unnervingly cold. His eyes, black as ink, bore into mine, and for a moment, it felt like he was peeling back the layers of my mind, searching for something. "We've met before." "Many times," he continued, circling me like a vulture. "In your dreams." The words struck me like a blow to the chest. I could barely breathe. How was this possible? My dreams were just that, dreams. I took a step back, shaking my head. No, this isn't real. This can't be real. The world around me seemed to blur as panic set in, but the man, this shadow from my sleep, was as solid as the pavement beneath my feet. He chuckled, a low, guttural sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Oh, it's real. And I've been waiting for you for a long time." His smile widened, revealing sharp, unnaturally white teeth. "It's time for you to remember." Before I could react, the street around us seemed to melt away, the buildings dissolving into darkness. It was as if the world itself was being swallowed by the void in his eyes. I could hear whispers, faint at first, then growing louder. The voices from my dreams. They were all around me, closing in, speaking in a language I couldn't understand but somehow felt deep in my bones. And then, with a final, deafening roar, everything went black. Hey! Subscribe for more true scary stories. I woke up gasping for air, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. The room was dark, eerily silent except for the rapid thudding of my pulse. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that it had been just another nightmare. But as I reached for my phone on the nightstand, my hand froze. I wasn't in my bed. I wasn't even in my apartment. I sat up, my surroundings slowly coming into focus. The room I found myself in was unfamiliar. The walls were a deep, blood red, cracked and peeling in long strips, revealing blackened wood underneath. A single flickering light bulb swung overhead, casting shadows that danced unnervingly on the floor. I was lying on a small, rickety cot in the corner, and the air was thick with the stench of decay and mildew. My skin crawled as if something unseen was watching from the darkness. I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing. How did I get here? Where was I? I reached for the door, only to find it locked tight, the handle cold and unyielding beneath my grip. Panic began to rise in my chest. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky, but the room swallowed the sound. There was no answer. Suddenly, a noise behind me, a soft shuffle, like something moving in the shadows. I whipped around, my eyes darting to the far corner of the room. That's when I saw it. The door. It hadn't been there before. The same man from my dream, the one with the hollow eyes, stood next to it, his face half hidden in the darkness. "You're not supposed to be here yet," he said softly, as if to himself. His voice was calm, detached, but there was an edge of impatience in his tone. "What do you want from me?" I demanded, my voice breaking. The fear gnawed at me, but anger bubbled beneath the surface now. "Why are you doing this?" My words echoed in the small room, but he didn't seem to care. His eyes, those empty, soulless pits, locked onto mine, and for a moment, I swore I saw something flicker in their depths. He took a step forward, his movement slow, deliberate, like he was savoring the moment. "It's not about what I want," he said, tilting his head ever so slightly. "It's about what you've already given." His hand reached for the door behind him, and with a creak that made my blood run cold, it swung open. Beyond it was nothing, just an endless black void, like the world had simply stopped. I recoiled, the air in the room growing colder, biting at my skin. "You belong here," he continued, his voice barely more than a whisper now. "In the place between dreams and waking. You've been here before, even if you don't remember. This is where they come for you." I stepped back, shaking my head in disbelief. "I'm not going through that door. I'm not." My hands pressed against the cold, cracked wall behind me, searching for something, anything, that could lead me out. But there was no escape. His smile widened, and I could feel the void pulling at me, tugging at the very edges of my consciousness. "You don't have a choice," he whispered, his voice like a hiss of wind through a graveyard. Then, without warning, the floor beneath me gave way, and I was falling into the endless blackness beyond the door. The sensation of falling was endless, like I had been cast into a bottomless pit. The wind roared in my ears, but there was no light, no ground in sight, just the suffocating blackness pressing in from every direction. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. My limbs flailed, grasping for something, anything to anchor me. Just when I thought the darkness would consume me completely, I landed, softly, like sinking into thick, wet mud. I blinked, trying to adjust my eyes to the new surroundings. I was no longer in the room, no longer falling. Instead, I found myself standing in a dense, misty forest, though the trees seemed unnatural, twisted into strange shapes, their bark an eerie shade of black. The fog clung to my skin, damp and cold, and the only sound was the distant rustling of leaves. But I wasn't alone. I could feel it, the presence of others, watching, waiting. I stumbled forward, my legs weak beneath me. "This isn't real," I whispered to myself, trying to shake the growing sense of dread. But everything felt too vivid, the cold seeping into my bones, the mist swirling around my feet, the smell of rot and damp earth. I could hear footsteps now, crunching softly on the dead leaves behind me. I turned quickly, my breath catching in my throat. That's when I saw them. A group of people stood just beyond the nearest tree, their faces pale and lifeless, their eyes dull and glassy. There were men, women, even children, all of them dressed in tattered clothes. They didn't speak, didn't move, just stared at me with that same hollow look. My heart pounded in my chest as I took a step back. "Who are you?" I asked, though my voice trembled. One of them, a young girl with long, tangled hair and a vacant expression, took a step forward. Her lips moved, but the words that came out were barely more than a whisper. "We're the dreamers," she said, her voice flat, empty. "We're trapped here, in the in-between, like you." "Trapped?" I repeated, confusion and fear swirling in my mind. "What are you talking about? I don't belong here." "I'm not," but my words faltered as the girl's gaze shifted, looking past me. The others in the group began to move, slowly at first, then with more urgency, their faces contorted with something between fear and desperation. "You shouldn't have come here," the girl whispered, backing away. "He'll take you too." Before I could ask her what she meant, the mist around us thickened, swirling violently as if stirred by some invisible force. From the fog, I saw him, emerging from the shadows like a phantom, the man with the black eyes. His presence sucked the air from the forest, and the dreamers scattered, disappearing into the trees as quickly as they had appeared. He approached me, his steps slow, deliberate. "I told you," he said softly, "there's no escape." I stumbled backward, my feet sinking into the wet earth. "What do you want from me?" I shouted, the terror now rising in my throat. But his expression remained unchanged, his hollow eyes boring into mine. "This place is yours now," he whispered, and with a flick of his hand, the ground beneath me began to tremble. The trees bent unnaturally, their branches curling like claws, reaching for me. "You are one of us. A dreamer. And like them, you'll never leave." The mist thickened once more, swallowing everything in sight, and the last thing I saw before the darkness claimed me again was the twisted grin on his face. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my apartment, at least, that's what it looked like. The familiar shape of my bed, the pale light filtering through the blinds, the faint hum of the city outside. For a brief moment, I believed it was all over, that I had escaped the nightmare. But then I noticed the shadows. They were wrong, stretching unnaturally across the walls, twisting and writhing like living things. I sat up slowly, my heart racing. Something was off, deeply off. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed and stood, the wooden floor cool beneath my feet. The apartment was eerily quiet, the air thick with a silence that felt unnatural. As I moved towards the hallway, I caught a glimpse of something in the mirror on the far wall. It was subtle at first, just a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, I saw it clearly. My reflection was wrong. It moved a second too late, its eyes wide and hollow, mimicking my every move with a delay that sent a chill down my spine. I backed away from the mirror, my pulse quickening. "This isn't real," I muttered under my breath, trying to convince myself that I was still dreaming. But the fear in my chest was too real. I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me, suffocating me. Suddenly, a knock echoed through the apartment, soft at first, then growing louder, more insistent. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The sound came from the front door, each knock resonating through the walls like the beating of a drum. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. But I knew. Deep down, I already knew who it was. The knocking stopped, replaced by a low, rasping voice. "It's time to wake up." The voice was unmistakable, cold, smooth, and dripping with malice. It was him. The man from my dreams. He was here, in the waking world. I stumbled back, panic flooding my veins. This wasn't possible. He was a dream, a nightmare that haunted my sleep. He couldn't be real. But the shadows on the walls twisted and writhed as if alive, and the air in the room grew colder, more oppressive. The door rattled violently, the voice growing louder, more insistent. "Let me in." I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the floor as I sprinted towards the back of the apartment. But no matter how far I ran, the hallway seemed to stretch on endlessly, the walls warping and distorting around me. The air grew thick, choking me with every step. I could hear the whispers again, the voices from my dreams, calling my name, pulling me deeper into the nightmare. Finally, I reached the end of the hall, slamming into the door at the far end. I twisted the knob frantically, but it wouldn't budge. The voice was right behind me now, his breath cold against the back of my neck. "You can't escape," he whispered, his words sending shivers down my spine. "You belong to me now." With one final, desperate shove, I forced the door open. But as I stepped through, the world around me shifted. I wasn't in my apartment anymore. I was back in the forest, the twisted, fog-filled forest where the dreamers roamed. The man with the black eyes stood before me, a cruel smile tugging at his lips. "There's no waking up this time," he said, his voice echoing in the mist. "This is where you'll stay, forever." And then, without warning, the ground opened up beneath me, pulling me into the abyss once more. Hey! Subscribe for more true scary stories. Story 2. The First Card. The first postcard arrived on a Wednesday. I remembered because the sun had barely broken through the clouds, casting a grayish hue over the world as if it, too, was holding its breath. The card was weathered, the edges curling, the kind of thing you'd expect from a distant place. It bore the familiar handwriting of my mother, precise and looping, as if she had just sat down at a cafe and scribbled a note before heading off for some tourist activity. But that was impossible. My parents had been missing for 4 years. I stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the simple image on the front, an idyllic beach with a lighthouse in the background, the type of place they'd visit. Beneath it, her words, "Wish you were here, darling. The sun never sets." My hands trembled, and the card slipped from my grasp, falling to the floor like a dead leaf. I hadn't received a word from them since their disappearance in Mexico, and this card, this impossibility, made my stomach churn. "You okay?" My roommate, Jess, poked her head around the corner, noticing my pale expression. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I chuckled nervously. "Something like that." I handed her the card. She read it silently, raising an eyebrow. "Isn't this their handwriting?" She studied it closely, flipping it over as if looking for clues. I nodded, barely able to form words. "But they've been gone for years." The authorities had long since closed the case, leaving me with no answers and no closure. My parents had vanished without a trace on their vacation, somewhere deep in the jungles of Quintana Roo, exploring ancient ruins. The official story? Lost to the wilderness. The story in my nightmares? Something far darker. Jess gave me a look I couldn't quite decipher. Could be a prank, you know? Some sick joke. But her tone lacked conviction, and she knew as well as I did that this was no prank. There was something disturbingly real about the way the ink on the card bled slightly, as if touched by damp fingers, something unsettling about the faint scent of salt water clinging to the paper. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced through all the possibilities, none of which made sense. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind outside my window, which now seemed to carry a whisper that wasn't there before. Every creak of the house made me jump, every shadow seemed too long, too thick. It was as if the card had brought something with it, something, watching. And then the second postcard arrived. The second postcard came on Friday, just 2 days after the first. This one was worse. It arrived late in the afternoon, the light already fading outside, making everything seem dull and muted. I knew the mailman's footsteps by now, the familiar thud of letters hitting the floor. But today, I felt the weight of that postcard even before I picked it up. This time, the image on the front wasn't serene. It was a stark photo of a towering lighthouse perched on jagged cliffs, waves crashing violently against the rocks. A storm was brewing in the background, dark clouds swirling as if ready to swallow the light. My mother's handwriting was there again, too perfect for comfort. The wind never stops here, but the view is breathtaking. We wish you could see it with us. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as sandpaper. Something about the card made my skin crawl. It wasn't just the message, but the feeling it gave me, as if the lighthouse in the picture was watching me, beckoning me to look closer. Jess wasn't home, and I didn't want to be alone with it. My hand shook as I stuffed the postcard into a drawer, as if out of sight meant out of mind. But I knew better. Later that night, I lay in bed again, the same uneasy feeling gripping me. I tossed and turned, haunted by the image of the lighthouse looming over me. In my dreams, I was standing at the edge of those cliffs, wind whipping my hair, the lighthouse's single, rotating beam cutting through the mist like a beacon. But something was wrong. No matter how long I stood there, the light never passed over me. It stayed fixed on something behind me, something closer. I woke up drenched in sweat, gasping for air. I glanced at my clock, 3:07 a.m. My heart pounded in my chest like a drum, the silence of the apartment deafening. For a moment, I thought I heard whispers, the same hushed tone I'd imagined the night before, only this time louder, clearer. I wasn't imagining things anymore. It was real. By morning, I decided to show the second postcard to Jess, hoping she'd offer some sort of rational explanation. I found her sitting on the couch, sipping her coffee, a concerned look crossing her face as I handed her the card. "It's the same handwriting," she muttered. "This is getting weird, even for you. You think I don't know that?" I snapped, more out of fear than frustration. "I don't understand what's happening. It's like they're alive. Like they're sending me messages from wherever they are." Jess didn't respond for a moment, just staring at the card, the coffee cup forgotten in her hand. "Maybe they are," she whispered finally, her voice barely audible. I looked at her, confused. Maybe they're trying to reach out, from the other side. By Monday, the third postcard arrived, and with it, a creeping sense of inevitability. The photo this time was of a small, dilapidated village, a cluster of wooden shacks nestled deep in the jungle. A narrow dirt path wound through the scene, disappearing into the shadows of ancient trees. The air in the picture seemed thick, oppressive, as though the place hadn't heard the sound of a human voice in years. My mother's handwriting cut through the eerie stillness of the image. "We've found something incredible here. The locals don't speak, but their eyes tell 1,000 stories. You should come." I sat at the kitchen table, the postcard lying flat before me like a cursed relic. Jess wasn't around this time, and I was relieved. She'd only tell me what I already feared. This wasn't a prank, and whatever was sending these cards was pulling me somewhere I wasn't prepared to go. But where? And why now? It wasn't just the image that haunted me. It was the subtle shifts around me since the first postcard arrived. The lights in the apartment flickered more often, and there were noises, scraping, tapping, that echoed from the walls, always when I was alone. I'd wake up some nights, convinced that someone, or something, was standing at the foot of my bed, watching me. I was afraid to turn on the light. Afraid to see. I tried researching the locations on the postcards, using every tool I could find. But none of them matched real places. The lighthouse? Nothing like it existed. The village? Not on any map I could pull up. It was as if these locations were ghostly imprints, places that existed outside of the normal world. Or perhaps they existed somewhere, much worse. 2 days later, the fourth card arrived. I could tell it was different before I even opened the envelope. This time, it wasn't a photo of a place. It was something else. The front of the card was blank, but when I turned it over, a cold chill crawled up my spine. The handwriting was barely legible, frantic, as if scribbled in a hurry. "We can't leave. They won't let us go. Don't follow the path." I stared at the words, my hands trembling so badly I could hardly hold the card. There was no signature, no closing note of love or warmth from my parents. Just that desperate warning, etched into the paper like a final plea. The whispers were louder that night. They grew from the corners of my apartment, from the dark spaces beneath the doors, from the mirror in the bathroom, where my reflection seemed just a little too slow to follow my movements. Something was coming. I felt it pressing against the edges of reality, something ancient and hungry. And then the next day, I found the path. I hadn't left the apartment in days, and I wasn't even sure why I'd gone out this time. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe something was pulling me. I walked for hours, aimlessly at first, but I kept turning down streets that felt familiar, even though I'd never been there before. And then I saw it, the dirt path from the third postcard, winding between 2 rows of trees, as if it had been waiting for me all along. I don't know why I stepped onto the path. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn around, but something stronger pushed me forward. The air was different here, heavier, charged with an energy that made my skin prickle. The dirt beneath my shoes felt damp, though it hadn't rained in days. As I walked deeper into the woods, the sound of the city faded away, replaced by a thick, unnatural silence. Even the birds didn't dare sing here. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisted and gnarled like bones, casting long shadows that moved unnaturally, as if they were alive. The further I went, the harder it became to breathe, the air thickening like syrup. I checked my phone, no signal. Of course not. This place, whatever it was, wasn't on any map. It wasn't part of the world I knew. It was something else. Something ancient. After what felt like hours, I saw it. A clearing up ahead, bathed in a sickly, pale light. My heart raced as I stepped into the open space. In the center, there stood a single object, a large stone altar, cracked and weathered with age. And sitting on top of it was the final postcard. I picked it up with trembling hands, my breath coming in short gasps. The front was blank again, just like the last one. But the message on the back was different. It wasn't written in my mother's handwriting anymore. The letters were jagged, carved into the paper as if by something sharp. "We are waiting." The moment I read those words, the wind picked up around me, howling through the trees like a chorus of voices, screaming in a language I couldn't understand. The ground beneath me rumbled, and I stumbled back, my pulse pounding in my ears. I turned to run, but the path was gone. In its place was an endless stretch of trees, closing in on me like a cage. And then I saw them, my parents. They stood at the edge of the clearing, their faces pale and gaunt, their clothes torn and dirty, as if they had been wandering for years. But something was wrong. Their eyes were hollow, empty, like two black voids that seemed to suck in the light around them. "Mom?" My voice cracked, barely above a whisper. "Dad?" They didn't move, didn't blink. Just stared, their mouths twitching in a grotesque imitation of a smile. "You shouldn't have come," my mother's voice echoed in my head, though her lips never moved. "Now you'll never leave." Behind them, something stirred. A shadow, massive, formless, but undeniably there, rose up from the ground like smoke. It was as if the trees themselves were bending, twisting into the shape of something ancient, something that had been waiting for me all along. Its eyes, if they could even be called that, glowed faintly from within the darkness. The whispering grew louder, the voices now clear. "Join us. Stay. Forever." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The shadow surged forward, swallowing the clearing, swallowing my parents, swallowing me. I fell to the ground, the postcard slipping from my hand, the words "we are waiting" burned into my mind. And then, there was nothing but darkness. The postcards never stopped coming. The end. Subscribe for more true scary stories. Thanks for watching.